Pleased to be here to share with you my thoughts and some ideas around listening to Liberate. And it started really with a question and an observation. The observation is that the quality of everything we do depends on the quality of the thinking that we do first. In other words, good thinking results in good decisions and good actions. And if that's true, and I do think it is, then it would follow that helping each other and everybody else to think at our best and their best is the very best that we can do as leaders, because everything else follows from that. If we think well, we'll make good decisions and good actions. And so there are 3 questions for you I'm going to invite you to think about today that I hope will be useful for you in your changing landscape. Firstly, as leaders, do we want people to think for themselves? Do we really want that? Because when people think for themselves, we get all kinds of unexpected consequences. So do we really want people to think for themselves? Can you imagine that, what it would be like to have people really thinking for themselves? And if we do, and we'll look at why later, and I think most of us would say yes, how far can the people we lead go in their own thinking before they need ours? As leaders, you're very busy, you're doing lots of your own thinking. You can't do your own and theirs as well. So how far can they go before they need yours? And how do we create conditions with our own organisations and even our lives for quality thinking to happen? So these are going to be some questions that we'll look thinking about today, and we will have some chance to go into breakout groups and think about some more questions too. So it all started off really with our findings. We've had 40 years of observing in the thinking, what we call the thinking environment now, 40 years of observation about how and what makes the difference to the quality of how people think. And these became known as the thinking environment because after many years of observing what does it take for people to think for themselves, we find out after all it's actually nothing very gimmicky. It's not necessarily putting people through loads of creativity workshops or mental gymnastics. They can, of course, help. But it's more about, we found, the way that we are with someone. It's about the way that we are that tells them that they're worth being with, that they're worth listening to, and they are inherently able and intelligent to think for themselves. So when I'm with someone and they're thinking and we're talking, I'm actually not patient. I'm not listening patiently. I'm listening expectantly. I'm not waiting for my turn. And there may be times when maybe I'm not so interested in exactly what you're saying, but I'm very interested in the fact you're saying it. So our findings start with the way that we behave as listeners reliably and repeatedly seems to have more impact on the quality of their thinking than their IQ, their prior knowledge or their experience, which is a wonderful thing really, is that if we knew that the way that we are with people is actually an act of co-creation, that we can help them to think really well just by being with them in particular ways. And these are our findings, and none of this is based on a theory, it's all based on pure observation. And there are 10 factors or behaviours, and we call them now components, that seem to reliably make quite a significant difference. And today we'll be looking at some of those, and you actually don't need to remember all 10. They do actually form a system together for independent thinking. But there are some that immediately strike us as really, really important. And the first one is attention. It's a key component of creating this environment for people to think. And there's a difference between listening to ignite and listening to respond. And when we enter into a relational conversation with someone with the intention of sparking their thinking and not responding to it, they just think better. And we've seen it time and time and time again. We think it has some roots in neurobiology. We've had various people look at it, various psychologists and neurobiologists looking at it. And we think that it stems way, way back from how our thinking started to form as children. If we were lucky to have a caregiver that gave us attention, that gave us safety, security, and gave us that feeling that we could grow ourselves and actually did grow our neural pathways. So when we listen to someone with the real intention of igniting what they're saying, not responding to it, they will think better. We call this then generative attention. And this kind of attention is oddly liberating for both the listener and the thinker. Because imagine if you're with someone, let's say you're having a one-to-one meeting with someone in your team, and you're really listening to what they're saying in order to help them to continue to think well for themselves. You're not worried about what your next question is going to be. You're not worried about your response. You're just seeing where they go with it, and you're treating them as intelligent. And by that very act, they're feeling more intelligent. They're feeling more capable, more creative. We've also found that our minds seem to work best in the presence of a question. Imagine what it's like when you go to a meeting and there's a list of agenda items, just statements, budget, head count, etc. Imagine what happens to your mind differently when you actually see, things like, how do we make the best of our head count this year? How can we make the budget feel like it's going further? What's the best use of our time and resources? It starts you thinking, and I can just ask you to imagine you walking around shopping. Let's say that you've done the supermarket shop. You may even have a list with you. But as you're walking around, you're thinking questions all the time. Have we got coffee? Have we got enough? Will they like that? Is it cheaper down the road? We're just asking ourselves questions all the time. And we found that something phenomenal seems to happen when someone generates a question, that the mind with the question is usually the best mind to answer it. So imagine what it's like when you're a leader and people come to you with a question. They say, what should we do about X? What seems to happen is we anticipate that, or we assume that that is the end of their thinking. They come to us with a question, they don't know what to do anymore. What we found fascinatingly is that if we treat that as the beginning of their own answer, and we say, oh, that's interesting, yeah, what are your first thoughts? Something miraculous happens and they go, well, yeah, well, I thought I'd do this, and I thought we could try that, and I thought we could try that. And there seems to be a new energy when we actually feed their own question back to them. Or even if we just listen really intently and say, yeah, okay, what are your thoughts? It's just amazing what does happen. And it might be at that moment that all they actually needed was a little bit of encouragement to continue to think for themselves. Because really in our society, we're not necessarily geared to doing a lot of thinking for ourselves. And, if you think about this idea that every day when we go to work, we're really hoping that someone there will want to know what we think. But equally, at the same time, there can also be some concerns that someone's going to ask us what we think, because it puts us on the spot and it makes us responsible for our thinking. But if you have children, I would guess that if I asked you, and if you could speak, which I know you can't at the moment in this setting, to me, if you have children, most of the time, unless they're teenagers who've gone a bit off, we want our kids to be able to think for themselves, don't we? We want them to be able to come to their own decisions, make their own life, make their own choices, think things through well. And do we want that for those people at work too? Well, I think we do. It's just that we sometimes are so busy, we've forgotten that we really need them to think for themselves. What we've also found is that human mind seems to think in waves and pauses. And these pauses are often quite silent. And so if you're in a conversation with somebody and they go quiet, society normally says, well, in fact, the unwritten rules of society are that when someone stops speaking, somebody else will, sometimes before they've even finished. And what we found is that if we just give that little moment, we give that person's mind a chance to produce a new wave of thinking. So their silence doesn't necessarily mean they've run out of ideas or they're stuck. They're just producing a new wave, but all they really need is encouragement to continue. And so we found that giving more attention by asking, what more do you think? Or just, what are your thoughts? Often seems to start a new wave. And we've tried and tested this in all kinds of organisations, hundreds. And in fact, in coaching, when I coach somebody in a thinking environment, we agree that I don't speak unless I'm invited. And when they've run out and they have a wave and a gap and a pause, we agree that I will not offer an opinion or a traditional coaching question. I'll simply ask them, what more do you think or feel I want to say? And something miraculous seems to happen. And I often have sessions where that's all I ask for a whole hour. on their invitation, and that person effectively self-coaches and self-manages and does everything you would expect in a normal coaching session. So what we've also found in meetings, in events, conferences, mentoring, coaching, even mediation, well, all sorts of environments, is that if you use a thinking environment, you create one, it uses the time you have more effectively, because it's not full of interruptions. And most of our lives, we get interrupted all the time when we speak. Most of us have become, through the busyness of life, habitual interrupters. And interestingly, perhaps, it's paradoxical that when independent thinking is welcomed, we found that people become more collaborative. I think there's an inherent drive in humans to be more collaborative, but when we make it possible to ask people, what do you think, and what do you think, and what do you think, they do become more collaborative. So these are the 10 components. You don't need to remember them all, but you will get a copy of this postcard. And these are attention, ease, equality, various things that are about ways of being with people. And we're going to explore some of these today. So it's about being intentional as well. I know that in other previous Academy Wales in events, you've been focusing on things like conscious leadership and intentional leadership. And this is very much an intentional way of being with people. It generates independent thinking so that people think with rigor, imagination, courage, and in grace. So you've listened beautifully to me for 15 minutes. So I'd just ask you to bear with me for another 5, because I'm then going to invite you to breakouts to think about this. And I also know that you've covered some of these things with Fee over the last few days. So you've done a fair bit of pair work on phones. So today our breakouts will be focused mostly on group ways of being in a thinking environment. And of course, we will consider what this actually means for you in your one-to-one conversations and interactions, so that you can immediately apply these ideas back at work after just this session. There's a whole body of learning and research going on behind the thinking environment. So you're just getting a snippet of it today, but my experience is that even having had some of these ideas, you'll have something really practical to take. So I'm going to share a couple of the components with you first of all. So attention. Attention means listening without interruption and with interest in where the person will go next in their thinking. It's actually an act of creation. These puppies clearly are waiting for food. They've got nothing else on their mind at all. They are waiting for something. They're waiting, probably food, but they've got nothing else on their mind. Imagine what it's like if you get that kind of attention. Your kids often demand that of you, don't they? If you're on your mobile phone, and the kids will grab your face sometimes to say, "Mummy, Daddy, look at me." They want that. So we found that the quality of our attention is the most important thing that determines the quality of somebody else's thinking. And in a way, it's an act of co-creation, because 2 people then become responsible for that thinking, but only one of them is doing it. So attention, when it's driven with the promise of no interruption, that's the promise. And there seems to be something very important about knowing you won't get interrupted versus getting lucky that you don't. If you know you're going into a conversation where someone's going to invite you to speak and they've promised not to interrupt you, you will think better than if you're waiting to be interrupted. So it's that powerful. Most of our time in our culture, we use eye contact to let people know that we're thinking about them and we're paying them attention. There are all sorts of researches going on around the world to say what other kinds of attention, how do other societies know you're giving attention? But even in most intimate relationships, you give eye contact. The other thing that we found is that when there's a creation of ease, which is an internal state that's free from rush or urgency, it creates the very best conditions for thinking. Now, clearly in the public sector and the public service, ease can be very, very hard to find. You're strapped for resources, strapped for time, and you've got some increasing pressures on you, and ease can be really hard to find. It can be hard to take a breath. And we see what's calling us most loudly. And yet I'm just going to invite you for a moment to put your hand in front of your face and see what you can see there. And yet, if you push your hand back further, you begin to see your hand as a whole. You see it differently. You see the bigger picture because you've taken time to look up from what's going on. And you can do that through the creation of ease. And that's a deliberate creation. I'm going to stop what I'm doing here because it's all in front of me and it's all around. I'm just going to take a step back, take a breath, look at my hand, and I see my hand differently. And that helps us to see the situation differently. And it helps us to become expansive in our thinking. So if you're with someone and they're impatient for you to finish, what's happening to your thinking? If you're with someone and you're being impatient because you're busy, what's happening to their thinking? What we're telling them is, you don't matter, this doesn't matter, I want you to get on, get to the point. So stress hormones raise up, cortisol raises up, and when we're under fire, that can lead to friendly fire. So when we deliberately create ease, and even if it's only a window of time, it doesn't have to be hours, just, we've got 10 minutes. Let's just relax. Let's look at each other. Let's listen. Let's turn our phones off. Let's remove distractions. Because the paradox is that you can't have movement in your thinking until you have stillness. Thinking about equality, another of the components, even in a hierarchy, people can be equal as thinkers. They don't have to be equal in terms of paycheck, level of service, job, responsibility, but every one of us has the capacity to think for ourselves. And if we feel that that's valued, we will contribute more. So thinking that we're equal helps us behave in a way that's equal, and it helps others to behave in a way that's equal. And part of that equality is giving equal time to think. And I've been into and observed many meetings where some people haven't spoken for the whole of the meeting because they haven't been invited by somebody powerful, or they haven't felt that they have anything to contribute. Whereas if at the start of a meeting, we all knew that we were there for a reason and that we could all have a chance to speak if we wanted one, no pressure, then we find that if we start off with everyone having a turn, then that automatically seems to, well, naturally seems to help people to speak more often in the rest of the meeting. So the result then is that equality keeps the talkative people from silencing the quiet ones because they know that everyone's got to have a turn, and it invites the quieter ones to step forward and take their rightful turn. As it says here, what lessens one of us lessens all of us. And fourthly, and this is the fourth component I'm going to share with you for now, is difference. If we prioritize divergent and different thinking, and we understand people's lived experience, we'll get better ideas, better thinking. So to think for ourselves well, we need to surround ourselves with people from different identity groups so we can take their experiences into account when we're all making decisions. We want to be able to understand as full as possible people's lived experience, their social context, their unique contributions, their skills, their ways of being and thinking. And in a highly regulated environment, it can be very hard to welcome divergent thinking, for example. So we have to try and balance that. For example, if we've got rules to follow, we want people to comply with those rules, but equally we do want to hear what their different thinking and ideas is. So the greater the diversity of the group, the greater the difference in perspective. And the key to difference is the idea that it's safe to be me, safe to be different, safe to not agree with you, safe to disagree, safe to say, I don't get this, to know that my ways of thinking and my being is valued, and my identities and what makes me unique. So I'm going to share with you one of what we call the building blocks of the thinking environment. And these are these simple tools that you can use. And I'm sure that many of you do rounds already at the start of your meetings or during your meetings. So there's normally a meeting facilitator of some kind in a meeting. And if you're meeting virtually, it might just mean that you just draw or you send around a PowerPoint with people's photos sitting as if they were around a table. Then you've already got a table that you can follow. Or it might be just putting their names around and sharing those at the start. Or it might mean passing to the next person on your screen, as you've probably been doing a lot of in the last couple of years. So in a bigger group, it can be hard to remember who's spoken and who's not. So if you're not following an exact round like a visual round, your facilitator can help by making a note of who's spoken. So it's a kind of sort of reassuring feeling. A round is a bit like sitting around a campfire, sharing stories of the day or beginning the day. And everyone is there, and you will already agreed in a meeting, and I'm sure you've agreed on this course what your confidentiality rules are for this cohort. So I don't need to say anything about that. So a round always starts with a question because the mind thinks best in the presence of a question. So the chair states the meeting, the question to be addressed in the round, and then determines the direction of a round, you know, go to your left or your right, or go clockwise, or pick somebody else out on the screen if you don't have a round visual. Oh, I've got the wrong order there. You asked, but it doesn't matter. You asked for a volunteer to begin. We don't pick somebody out and say, you start. We ask for a volunteer to begin. And then it goes in the direction that we've set. And we just remind people to give attention to the person who's speaking, to be succinct when it's their turn, and ensure everyone has a turn. And then we agree whether or not a timekeeper is needed. People new to rounds often decide that they're going to start practicing them with a clock and say, we've each got 2 minutes here. Let's use a time to see what that feels like. And then once we're used to it, we can drop the timer. That's the round. So I'm going to share that with you. And then I'm going to share the second building block, which has some of the same principles, which is no one interrupts while someone else is speaking. But in a round, we agree not to interrupt, and we decide it's an intention to keep interest in what the person speaking will think and say next. In this open discussion, anyone can speak. There's no particular order. And if you don't want to speak, you don't need to, but actually the same. But what we do invite people is to try not to queue, because when you're putting your hand up, what you're saying is, I've stopped listening to you because what I'm thinking is much more pressing. So it just requires a bit of ease there. But the person speaking stays true to their promise to be succinct in return for not being interrupted. I'm going to invite you into breakouts now, and these have been set up for us. So the first thing I'm going to invite you to think about is, what are your thoughts about the need for independent thinking in the public services today? So I'm going to invite you all to have a turn at that, and your facilitator knows these questions. I'm not able to put them into the chat box, but hopefully the facilitator will be able to do that for you or remind you of that when you get into the room. So 15 minutes for that. And then when you come back, you're going to stay in those rooms. And then I'm going to invite you to have an open discussion. It's only 5 minutes. It's not long for 15 people. This is just a taster. And what I've asked the facilitators to do is to gather any thoughts from the open discussion about the process, just so we're going to look at the process. And we'll come back to the question about what are your thoughts about the need for independent thinking. So we're getting some great comments coming in that some of you can see. I've got them on my phone here because I've got some technical challenges. So we've got some fantastic stuff coming. Not being one of the first to speak might make people feel more nervous. People also might like everything you'd thought already been said. That's a really good thought. Sometimes there's a pressure in groups to come up with something novel. Can I not say something? And that's a really good test actually for leaders, is if we want independent thinking in our organisations, then it's often a challenge for leaders not to be the first one to speak. Because when you do that, you effectively could have the capacity to be disrupting equality. Because if it's the leader that always speaks first, what can also happen is that people become dependent on that leader speaking first. And it's often a lot of pressure on you as a leader to be the first one. That's known as a basic assumption dependency, where people look unconsciously to the leader in the room to say, well, I don't know what I think, what do you think? So it makes you feel massively responsible for their thinking, actually, for their ideas. So that's something there. So leaving space to come in, that was from group 7. It's group 7. So the equality of this way of working helps people to bring in the quieter voices. So I would just urge, one of those things you do is resist the urge to fill the space even when you feel uncomfortable, because what we're doing by doing that is rescuing people from thinking for themselves. We're in cultures of, our culture is such that people aren't always encouraged to think for themselves. Also, one thing we don't know about people that are new to us is what their history is from their previous organisation. What kind of experiences are they bringing with them about being listened to, about being given permission to speak or not? And so they'll be carrying some of that collectively. So imagine you've got a team of 20 people. They've all got this tapestry of experience they're bringing to that. And sometimes it's just unvoiced. So that's one thing about the role of leaders, is to be the silent conductor of the orchestra, really, to really, I think as well, send the message out that independent thinking is important and you really want that and you welcome it. But somebody's also commented in group 6 that independent thinking is not really that embraced. No, it's not. It's not a widely held idea, and it can be sort of anarchic and a bit disruptive. What does everybody here think? And I remember many years ago, a client contacted me and said, I'd like my organization to become a thinking environment. I really, really want to commit to this journey. And so I said, well, that's great. And as we chatted, I said, I just want to check something with you. Are you really ready for independent thinking? And he said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, it might mean people don't agree with you. It might mean that people have different views and are willing to challenge the status quo. Is that what you're looking for? And he said, absolutely, yes. Absolutely, I am. So it's a risk when we want independent thinking. So it can be difficult in some organisations where there's an agenda, and the space for independent thinking isn't recognised. And I'm going to share an idea with you in a moment that can help to shift that a bit. So there's a lot of thinking about operational, but often not an awful lot of time to think about what does this really mean to me. And when we don't have time to think, it means we don't necessarily connect so well with our values. So we're operating from a head and a heart perspective, head and a hands perspective. And yet, if we made room for our heart to express how we felt, we're much more likely to be committed and engaged and to see things through. So it goes back to a culture of psychological safety, absolutely. So in group as well, in the feedback from the exercise, people were really building on ideas. People were actively listening in group 3, and everyone was authentic and everyone was succinct, which is fantastic. And that's often the challenge, is to, if you know you're not going to be interrupted, there's a kind of deal here. I promise that we won't interrupt you, but in return, we ask you to promise to try and be succinct when it's your turn. And so once you get into this flow of this equality of this promise, and yeah, someone said that people are really uncomfortable about comfortable with leaving silences when doing an online meeting. I've noticed, and you might have noticed this too over the last couple of years, how actually meeting behaviours have improved, because it's really hard to talk over somebody, whereas in a room it's much easier. So in group 9, they lost a facilitator, had a valuable conversation. They talked about techniques for bringing people into meetings, the value of diversity when it has a voice, and pandemic thinking. What was different? What did we learn about ourselves and about how we work together in a crisis during the pandemic? So some fabulous thinking there. And I hope I've given justice to everyone's feedback. That's really, really useful. Yeah, I just want to actually mention about managing expectations. I think it's really great if leaders can very early on model this kind of behaviour themselves, because then it sets an expectation and a tone that I'm not going to interrupt you either. I've done work on thinking environments where a leader hasn't actually behaved in the way that they've been invited me to train their staff. So it's really important, as with all of these things, that leader models. So thank you for your feedback. It's been really invaluable. And I'm sure there's lots I can't do justice on today. So I'm just going to suggest we have a 5-minute break away from the camera. And it might be that you look outside your window, you look at some of the scenery if it's around you. You just take your eyes off the camera and off the screen for a while. And we come back at midday. We've got a shorter one than planned because you had one before. But you just give yourself time to go away, reflect a bit, make some notes if you wish, but just give yourself, and ideally connect with something in nature that you've either been thinking about or you've brought back into your space. Maybe you've been out gathering things, or you look out of your window. And we'll be back here. Please keep this room open. So welcome back. I hope you had a very good little break. There was actually a podcast on yesterday on BBC Radio 4, the Just One Thing podcast, Dr. Michael Mosley, and he was talking about taking very short breaks, even just for a couple of minutes, has been found to boost people's creativity and productivity. Just actually timing in, he said even 2-minute breaks seems to make a difference. So that's why we try and do that. So I'd like to introduce an idea to you that we call the 2 worlds of thinking. These are some of the other ideas that have come out of our observations. One thing that really appeals to me, and always has done, I've been a coach and a facilitator, a therapist for sort of 30 years, and I was always looking for what is the thing that can make the most difference most quickly in organisations, but in a way that doesn't feel rushed. And I think that's why when I discovered the thinking environment 15 years ago, it just met everything that I could possibly have hoped for my clients to get, because it's practical, it's based on observation, not some necessarily academic theory. There's nothing wrong with academia, but it's really based on lived experience and feedback from people. And some of the ideas that have come out of those observations are about how we can, if we can see the world a bit differently. And this idea of two worlds of thinking has come about. It's as if we live sometimes almost in two worlds. There is this one large world that we're used to, we wake up to every single day, and it's the world where exchange thinking is the norm. And by that, I mean that when you say something, there's an implicit assumption that somebody else is going to speak afterwards, or sometimes before you've even finished. And this is a world that we're used to. We wake up to it. We go to work, we have conversations around the family table, we go to see another professional, they ask us a question, they give us an answer, we're in meetings, there's an implicit assumption by the fact there's going to be an exchange of some kind of more than one person. And it's characterized by, though, the hunger to reply. You know, you go somewhere, someone's saying something to us, and we want to reply. We've got this hunger to reply. And it's also the world of influencing other people's thinking. And if you've trained as a coach, you'll know that coaches are taught to ask great questions, and therapists are asked to ask great questions. But in all my years of journey, as in all the coaching training and the therapy training I did, I realized what I was being taught to do was I was hungry to reply to what I was hearing, and I was hungry to put my 2 pennies in. What I didn't realize until I came across thinking environment, that every time I said something, it had the potential to take somebody away from where they were going to go with their thinking to where I thought they should go. So even if, you know, one of the standard coaching tools, therapy tools, is to echo somebody, you know, echo a word. They say, you know, this happened to me when I was a child. And you go, child? Or, you know, my manager and I don't get on. So we're making a choice about where we think that thinking should go. And that's the world that we're used to. But it goes against really the idea that people can think for themselves. And it's characterized by this hunger to reply. So, and it's also the world we're brought up in school. You know, you're asked what you think, you get rewarded for being the one to come up with an answer. So it's a good world, it's a great world, but it's a very large world, and it's the world that is quite dominant in most of our societies today. Whereas the world of independent thinking, where you think for yourself and somebody else is interested in just your thinking and not in theirs too, this is very small in comparison. And this is characterized by a hunger and an intention to listen to ignite someone's thinking. And we don't get these very often. We don't get to go into the world of independent thinking often enough, because the world of exchange thinking is our norm. It's our norm in societies. So the thinking environment aims to address that. It aims to address the fact that, yes, we do need exchange thinking. We need people's ideas. We need to spark off each other. We need to learn from each other. We need to contribute. But we've done so at the expense of the world of independent thinking. So the thinking environment is an attempt to sort of balance those two worlds out a little bit. Because, as I said, the exchange thinking world is dominated by the hunger to respond, and independent thinking is listening to ignite. And of course, in that world of exchange thinking, there is a kind of spectrum in a way of independence. You might be with someone in an exchange conversation and they do listen more than others. Or there may be a subject for which people want to listen more, or at any particular time. So there is a spectrum in that. It doesn't mean to say that it's full of interruptions. But when you think about most conversations, and sadly after today, what you'll notice is how much interruption happens everywhere, and it's going to drive you up the wall, because once you notice that, you think, no, stop it, listen, let me finish. So you notice that, and I mean, I'm speaking for myself, I would like to think I'm a reformed interrupter. My partner actually says I'm a work in progress. I think we all are. We're all a work in progress because we get excited. We want to be helpful. We want to contribute. But if we could think, well, I want to try and expand how I create worlds for independent thinking, then that's an intentional thing. And interestingly, some research shows, lots of different research over the years, that we are clearly much more used to the world of exchange thinking than we are of independent. some research back in the States a little while ago said it shows that it took the maximum of 18 seconds for doctors to interrupt patients, for example. And that's not an accusation. Doctors are under time pressure. Many of you here aren't doctors, you're in other parts of public service, but you're all under pressure. But some professions are taught to question in order to funnel into an answer so they can diagnose or suggest or guide. But 18 seconds is the average time. I don't think my GP listens to me for 18 seconds. I don't think they even look at me half the time. And interestingly, some other research said that patients don't always get to say the true reason for visiting their GP, because it seems that people store up things. And if they don't get a chance to say the last thing, which is usually the third thing, which is often the one that's pressing on their mind, but they hold it back. It might be something a bit embarrassing, or it might be a throwaway comment. But lots of people say they don't always get to really think through their thoughts with their GP. If you go into a meeting and you observe how often interruptions happen, it's around every 2 minutes, and it can be more frequent than that. And that means there's lots of thoughts that don't get born. We don't know what someone's going to say. So, for example, in a meeting or in a coaching situation, I don't interrupt. I work really hard not to interrupt. It's become a lot easier over the years. I don't interrupt until I'm absolutely sure that what I'm about to say is going to be better than what someone else was about to think or say. Unless I'm sure. And of course, I won't ever be able to be sure if I don't get to hear what they say. So I've learned not to interrupt. And really startlingly, women are 2 to 3 times more likely than men to be interrupted by either sex. So women interrupt women 2 to 3 times more than they would interrupt men, and men interrupt women at the same rate. So that's an interesting statistic. So the research shows that we're much more used to this world of exchange thinking. So it just makes, imagine what a world would be like where you could go into meetings and you knew that we each had a turn, and you knew that you wouldn't be belittled, you knew that you would also respect other people's chance for a turn. So that brings us back to one of the components, is the component of encouragement. And encouragement is an interesting word, because if we look at what's in the middle of the word encourage, it's the word courage. And actually, if we think about where the word courage comes from, it means heart in French. To give heart to somebody else, brave heart to somebody else. So when we encourage people, we give them courage to go to the unexplored edge of their thinking, because they're not often used to that. And the reason they're not used to it is because competition often prevails. Again, I think I take this back to our school years. We are rewarded for being the ones with the best ideas in class. We are rewarded for all kinds of competition that we have. And yet the integrated way we're trying to work, particularly post-COVID and in the public service, means we've got to try and move away from that old competition and be really interested in the best idea wherever it comes from, whoever's got it, whatever their rank. So we need to kind of break away from the tyranny, and I think encouragement is one of the tools that can break us away from the tyranny of exchange thinking. Look, we do it naturally with children. When children fall over, we pick them up and we say, come on, you can do this. We hold them by the hand. They want to do it themselves. Here, this picture is this child being given encouragement to pursue their own path, to make their own explorations. So we don't always do that at work. And it's a lot of the time it's competition. Imagine the last time you were in a meeting back at work and it wasn't one that you felt very comfortable in. I would guess that you would have been seeing and hearing some competition. So imagine that somebody makes a suggestion in a competitive environment. Someone is very soon going to interrupt and say, yeah, but we should do this, or no, what about that? So they think, and they often use, and I've done it myself, expressions like, I'd like to build on that, meaning, no, I'd like to trump it with a better card. But instead, imagine what would happen if somebody said an idea in a meeting and somebody else said, that's a really interesting thought. Would you like to say more about that? Can you say more? Tell us more. We don't get that so much in meetings. We bring our cards, and it's like we want to play all our cards in our meeting and put them all down to show that we can trump. So look back as well at your family of origin. If you were fortunate to have a family of origin, or any environment, who was first to speak around the table? Could you get a word in? And that's, you know, that often gives us a clue as to how we behave in meetings. You know, the first organisation we join is often our family. So what were the meeting behaviours around the dinner table? You know, where did we learn to get our voice heard? And if we had to speak up a lot or interrupt in order to get heard, we may well carry that through into adult lives. Because what we found as well, that when we cease competition as thinkers, it really does enable other people to feel more courage. And then we feel greater courage, but it doesn't mean that it's courageous, doesn't mean to say it's competitive courage. So it's, you know, being better than is not necessarily being good. It's just, you know, trying to be better than. So the thinking environment tries to prevent, and it certainly does prevent, this internal competition. So saying to people, what more do you think? Is really, really surprising what can happen. When we just ask that simple question, it seems to help them to create a new wave of thinking. It's a catalyst. This was even noticed by Roman philosopher Ovid, who said that a new idea is delicate. It can be killed by a sneer or a yawn. It can be stabbed to death by a quip and worried to death by a frown on the right man's brow. Imagine what it's like when you're in a situation and somebody squints a bit or does that or yawns or whatever. What can happen to your thinking? You can lose courage. You can give up. You think, oh, well, I won't go there, because you're frightened of being attacked, dismissed, ridiculed, all those things that can happen. So our ideas can be quite delicate. I'm not suggesting we walk around on tippy toe with people, but I am suggesting that we can create an environment where we're really interested in their ideas and we find a time and a space to let those people share them. And of course, this ties in with psychological safety. And those of you that may have come across Michael West's work on compassionate leadership will understand a lot more about this as well. So psychological safety is a term defined by Amy Edmondson that you may have already covered this week. And it's a shared belief of members of a team that the team is safe for what's called interpersonal risk-taking. And this is where they're not afraid to do certain things. Not know something, not understand, disagree or admit mistakes. So when a team is safe to do this, they will think better. Because a psychological safety is a way of creating a learning environment rather than a blaming environment. And that's what we try to create in a thinking environment, is that whatever people think, feel or want to say, that they don't know, that they don't understand, that they disagree or that they can make mistakes, will help everyone to think better. And it's a team characterized by interpersonal trust and mutual respect. And one of the things that I often do when I'm working in organizations to introduce thinking environments is we do a little brief survey at the start to find, or we draw on the engagement surveys and look at what's the culture like and what kind of behaviors and the feelings of people. And one of the things we notice pre and post thinking environment work, which is not a quick fix, you know, it's not an hour seminar, it's a deliberate, intentional set of behaviors by leaders, backed up with training, backed up with all sorts of things that you can do, is respect levels increase. People say, I feel respected at work, and they're comfortable in being themselves. And if you are interested in finding out more about this, if you go to Google Aristotle, if you Google the words Google Aristotle Project, you may have heard about, this was a way that they were looking in Google at what made an effective team. So it led on to some research they did about what makes an effective leader and manager. And what they did was they surveyed thousands of 182 teams, actually, or 184 teams across all different functions. Now, I'm not suggesting you're like Google, but one would think that Google people are pretty smart and pretty, you know, kind of up there in terms of how well they think, because, you know, Google's an inventor, isn't it, really? And they surveyed these teams and they found they first of all decided what high performance looked like in different settings. You know, was it KPIs? Was it staff engagement? Was it whatever it was? Was it revenue? So they looked at how they were going to measure effective team performance, because they wanted to know what made an effective team. Was it the team makeup? Was it the diversity of the team? Was it the age group? Was it what they knew already? Was it how they hired? what a massive amount, of course. You know, you'd expect that with Google and lots of algorithms involved, I'm sure. And then they looked at the results, and the thing that made the most significance to the team's performance, way beyond their manager, way beyond what they knew, way beyond what they were paid, was their level of psychological safety, with these 4 factors, that when they could do these things, they performed higher. That was also then an environment in which people felt they could express their feelings. And in an organisation, sometimes there's an assumption when we talk about feelings that we're going to mean upset, don't we? You know, it was all very emotional. Emotions are a whole range. They provide us with information. They provide us with insights. They provide us with data. They provide ourselves with data, and they provide others with that. But in many organisations, emotions aren't really welcome, particularly if they're seen as the negative ones. I don't actually view emotions as positive or negative. They are all very valid experiences, and they're telling us something. But what we find is when feelings are inhibited, that inhibits thinking. Because if your energy is spent suppressing how you feel about something, that's where your energy's gone. It's not gone into thinking, it's not gone into engaging, it's not gone into collaboration. And thinking stops when we're upset. But if we can find ways in our organisations as leaders to really welcome in feelings, just enough, rethinking starts. And even if we have people who are angry, frustrated, depressed, upset, then finding a way for that to be completely great, because that means that when we can share those things, we've got greater trust, and also we will get greater thinking. So it might be that we have, our feelings are about, I don't agree. There's a divergence here. I don't agree with you. It might be feeling that somebody says, I feel really bonded with this team. I just love this team. It might be feelings of depression, whatever they are. If we can find ways of leaders, and if we, first of all, it starts with us, doesn't it? How able are we to express appropriately our feelings? And if we can relax and welcome them, then good thinking will ensue. And I also think about it at maybe if you are someone who finds themselves getting distressed, crying, or you have someone in your team that cries, that's because there's some strong emotions associated with whatever it is. If you allow that crying if you don't try and stop that crying, let's say in a one-to-one, and you don't hand somebody a tissue, which effectively can say to them, stop crying, I'm uncomfortable. If we sit with that for a moment and let them cry, it's a bit like we've had a rainstorm. So in a rainstorm, and then all the rain is all over the pavement, and then the rain stops, and then the sun comes out and shines, and the pavement dries. And if we can allow feelings to be expressed appropriately, and we can make it safe, we'll get better thinking. And another component of the thinking environment, closely related to that, is appreciation. We found time and time again that the human mind works best in the presence of appreciation. So it really means believing that people have a positive intention. Very few people do come to work saying, today I really want to muck up, or today I want to be unpopular. Very few, in my experience. But what we found is that when we treat people as valuable, as intelligent, and we look for them for their qualities, we look to their qualities, that we learn to notice what's good and we say it. In life, as we're growing up, we're often appreciated for what we've done and what we've achieved rather than for who we are. In life, we perhaps learn that appreciation is naive, whereas critical is to be realistic. You didn't get that right, and that was wrong. But in discussions, we found at the start of meetings, for example, when we invite people to do a round to bring them all into the room, and we invite them to think about something that's going well or something they're valuing, that the way that the meeting then runs is actually a lot more cohesive and a lot more engaging. We think, again, it's back to neurobiology. If you go into a situation expecting criticism, you're likely to be going in a defended state. You're likely to have gone down in a shutdown state. Whereas if you feel that the people you're with value you, you will be more likely to contribute, and you'll also be more likely to value them. So it's a bit like, you get the mirror neurons in the brain working, and we will disseminate much more appreciation. And the brain requires appreciation to think well. In the presence of criticism, we go into fight, flight, fear. So the thinking environment has also recognised some research done by Barbara Friedrichsen that there seems to be a kind of appreciation ratio versus criticism. And the thinking is that it's a ratio of 1 to 5. If you appreciate people 5 times more than you criticise them, you'll get better thinking. I don't suggest we go around measuring it, but it just gives you an idea of how we can flourish and foster greater thinking. I've done work in the past with people involved in the care system, and they found that and some of you here may be involved in those systems, that when we appreciate young people for their qualities rather than punish them for their behaviours and their actions, we will get better results from them. Whereas, so that's a really worth thinking about. What we've also found is that we're not so used to appreciating qualities. Even when I say to groups of people, could you just go into breakout rooms and appreciate somebody else for a quality you see in them? They come back and they say, oh, yeah, I really liked what you did. I really liked your, the project you produced. People find it harder to appreciate qualities. Things like kindness, thoughtfulness, compassion. What would our leadership be like if we started noticing some of those qualities in people? We'd get more of them. A bit about a thinking pair. We're not going to do a thinking pair today, and it will build on some of the work that you've been doing with Fee this week. I think Fee's actually already been doing thinking pairs. So essentially, it's a way of two people helping each other to think. And there are 2 roles, a thinker and a thinking partner. And each have a block of uninterrupted time to think aloud or think silently. Now you can use these thinking pairs at any point in meetings when thinking stalls, or if the meeting's too big, or there's some disagreements going on, and you think, okay, and I need to help people to start thinking differently. Invite people into thinking pairs. That creates more psychological safety than a big group. And you give them each an uninterrupted block of time to think about, and they can think out loud or they can think silently. And it starts with a question. For example, this is a question we start with in coaching, but you don't need to use this question because this is the biggest, widest open question we know of that we've experimented with for years. We ask people, what would you like to think about and what are your thoughts? But I have lots of clients in organisations where they start each Monday morning with a thinking pair with someone in the organisation, and they rotate it so they get to meet people across different departments, and they just buddy up with somebody and they do a think each week for a month, and then they swap partners. And they say, what would you like to think about? What are your thoughts? And the person says, well, today I'd like to think about what I'm going to do in this meeting later on, or my presentation, or a difficult conversation I've got to have. So we don't direct thinking. And then what we do is we ask them with a question because we know the mind thinks best in the present of question, and then we give them sustained generative attention. And what we find is terribly important is that we keep our eyes on them when we're their partner. But they don't need to keep their eyes on us when they're the thinker, because thinking often needs to move around the eyes to actually access new thoughts, new ideas. So we give attention on them until they ask for a question. So this is an agreement that we would make with people. I will listen to you. I'm going to give you 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever you agree. And I'm going to ask you, what would you like to think about? What are your thoughts? Or, we're working with the budget today. What are your thoughts about the budget? You can frame it. And you guarantee them you're going to give them attention, and you're going to be easeful, and you're going to be interested in what they're saying, and you're going to listen to ignite, not to respond. And you crucially make that promise not to interrupt. And then they have their allocated time. And if they need a question, though, if they dry up, they go, oh, I don't know, I'm stuck. Something miraculous will happen if you say, what more do you think or feel or want to say? And 9 times out of 10, they will have more. So after then the allotted time, they swap roles. So there's no reason why you can't do this with somebody in your team to create equality. Let's say you've got a subject you're thinking about, and maybe it's a project you're going to work on, and the person's going to lead it, and you're their leader, manager. You could even have that as a thinking session. So you've got this project to get going. In relation to this project, what are your thoughts? I'm going to give you 10 minutes. And I promise not to interrupt. And then I'm going to come back. And then I'm going to give you my thoughts. And it's not that my thoughts are any better than yours. We've just got time on this together. Then they end with an appreciation of quality. I really appreciate thoughtfulness, your kindness, your creativity, not what they're about to do or have done. So that's a lovely little tool you can experiment with. So I'm going to invite you now, rather than experiment with the tool, I'm going to invite you into another breakout room. And again, you can decide for yourself how you go round. If you're in person or online and you've got your little table, we send as I mentioned earlier, when I do virtual work and I know who's going to be there, I will put their name around a table and I'll send that out as a PowerPoint or even a photograph. And then I'll, as the meeting leader, say, we're going to go left on this one, I'm going to go right on that one, or clockwise. But when you're online with a group of people who you're not knowing who's be there, then you just might agree that somebody then passes on. So you don't get those long, awkward silences about who's going to speak next. They take responsibility. Again, you can decide if you want your facilitator to time you or if you can manage. We've only got 15 minutes again. So you've got up to a minute each if you want it. And in practice, of course, not all of your meetings will have 15 people, and you will find you'll have much richer discussions and or more in-depth discussions. But for the purposes of this, so I'm just going to ask you, in your life, have you ever known a time or even been promised that you could speak without being interrupted by anybody? Have you ever been given that promise? And so you've each got a turn to say as much or as little about that as you wish within around a minute. And then I'm going to invite an open discussion that you could then have for 5 minutes. And if you remember, the open discussion is anybody can speak as long as somebody else isn't. Just invite you to think, how might you want to experiment with thinking pairs? How could you use this kind of thing, or how could you adapt it? It doesn't have to be in its exact pureness, as I've said. And again, your facilitators are invited to take some notes on the open discussion responses. Not on, unless you wish to share, have you known a time? But it's really looking at the process of this exercise. So I'm going to invite then the tech whizzes to put you into breakouts again of 15 people with 20 minutes in total. Let's see what we've got here. We've got we've got in group 7, make time for the unintended thoughts that are slipping around for teams to use rather than asking the leader. Absolutely, that's a great way of doing that. To use thinking pairs as a way of really generating someone's thinking. And, in just doing that, we're telling people that you matter, aren't we? That's what we're doing, is saying to people, you matter, your thinking matters. And you can use them with peers, to explore an idea. When you're stuck, often what we find is when people are stuck, it's because they're making assumptions. And they may not know these assumptions are in the way. And so when you're with someone who's listening to you, it often seems to have this impact of freeing yourself from assumptions. And some group 4 ideas to experiment with. You could use it at mid-year reviews. Absolutely. Start off your mid-year review and a PMR. What are your thoughts about them? How's your year been for you? I'm going to give you 10 minutes. I'd just really love to hear what you have to say. You can use with key project stakeholders, reflecting on projects. Starting projects, absolutely. Creativity. What are your thoughts about how we can start this project? What are your thoughts about where you would start? And it's really good to get the question as open and wide as possible, particularly if there is hierarchy involved. Otherwise, I remember once worked with the head of a big media organisation, and he said that the moment I become directive, I dampen down creativity. When I tell people too much about what I want, they work too hard on trying to please me than coming up with creative ideas. And I really want, in a creative environment, I actually want mistakes in a creative environment, because if we're not making mistakes, we're not being creative enough. Now, clearly, in a public service environment, you can't be seeking mistakes. But I think that kind of spirit is really, really important for leaders. So pairs walking one-to-one, some of the work you've been doing with Fee, using the thinking pairs approach. The promise is the crucial thing. To promise you won't interrupt is very different from being lucky and not getting interrupted. So yeah, great. Thinking pairs may be a good way to engage with those who are repeating the same point in meetings. When people truly feel heard, they may have less need to keep going round in circles because they haven't been heard. When they get heard, that quietens their anxiety about being heard. And yeah, I think it's important, really good point, that it may not be comfortable for all individuals. This may be uncomfortable to be looked at. I work quite a lot with neurodiverse people, and it takes them a while to get into this. However, once they do, they say they become a lot more comfortable with the intensity of the interaction, not necessarily always with the eye contact. So what I do with people who are less comfortable or tell me they are, I just might ask them, I'd really like to give you attention. What would be the way that you would like me to show that I'm giving you attention? Would you like me to look at you? Would you like me to just, sit here? What would work for you? Make it a routine. A Monday morning paired thinking could be really great, really, really great. You connect, you get creative. And it's rare to sit down and talk about stuff. And they noticed it was easy to talk to somebody who's outside the work situation. And certainly when I write quite a lot, and when I write, I get really bad writer's block. I mean, I can go on for months sometimes, and I know that what I'm desperate for is a thinking pair. And the second I reach out to a friend and I say, I've got this article to write and I'm just completely blocked and I'm avoiding it and I'm procrastinating. Can I have a think with you? And they say, yeah. And they say, Linda, in relation to this article, what do you want to think about? What are your thoughts? And I'm off. And it's just liberating. That's all I needed, was someone else to tell me I mattered. So yeah, dive straight in and do it, try it. And you'd like to continue with someone who understands the concept, such as a summer school delegate. Yeah, if you've met someone on this group, on this cohort, and you could practice with. And one of the things that I'm really going to invite you to think about is you've come up with some fantastic questions in the chat. My guess is if I didn't answer them, you would. If you found someone to think them through with. So, for example, someone's asked a lovely question. Where was it? Where was it? Where was it? Where was it? It was before you went in. And I just want to, where was it? Oh, what happens to your thinking potential when you don't feel worthy of the appreciation, like imposter syndrome? I'd like you, whoever posed that, to Helen, actually, if you don't mind me naming you because you're in the chat box, I'd like you to take that question and have a think about it with somebody. What happens to your thinking potential when you don't feel worthy of the appreciation, like if you have someone with imposter syndrome? What will happen is the fact you've started that question will, I think, be the catalyst for an answer. And I've shared with you in the chat box a number of blog posts that I've written on the thinking environment. An idea came to me several years ago. And by the way, I should have, and I haven't done yet, credited Nancy Klein as the originator of the thinking environment some 40 years ago. We'll talk about her books in a moment. But I've learnt so much from being with Nancy over the years. She doesn't teach so much anymore, and she doesn't teach online. And she's older now. She's not retired. She's still writing beautifully. But I think one of the things to think about is, this idea came to me a few years ago, is that we often assume that when someone asks us a question, that they have stopped thinking and they've run out of ideas. But if we knew instead that their question was just the start of their answer, what would we do differently? If we knew that in articulating a question from, let's say, because it happens time and time again, I'm in an event or I'm in a meeting and someone says to me, yes, Linda, that's great, but what do I do about my team? Then I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. They've had a number of thoughts going through their mind. They possibly had some emotional responses to what I'm saying, and something miraculous has happened for that to get articulated into a question of just a few words. How did that happen? Isn't that amazing? It's just all that complexity there has been articulated into a question. And they say, so Linda, how do I do this? And if I say, that's an interesting thought, what are your thoughts? Then again, this miraculous, okay, well, I think. Now, clearly, it can be infuriating if you keep doing that to somebody and they think, I'm not in therapy, stop it, I don't like this. But if you find a way to build relationships and you let people know that actually I'm really interested in what you think, you'll find time and time again, people will solve their own thoughts. Somebody made a really great observation earlier on, is there is a difference between independent thinking and independent action. And this is not a suggestion that everyone goes off and does their own thing because they're independent thinkers. There may be times when you need that to happen. But the point of independent thinking is to give someone the time and the space to think about things so that when they do take action, it's well thought through. And it doesn't mean to say you've had to have influenced that action. So there is that difference really, but this is about building on the quality of the thinking. And if you can incorporate these 10 components into your ways of being and your ways of working, then you will find that you become more easeful. And by making time to slow down the way that we react and to slow down the way that you do things, you will find, I believe, a lot more liberal, a lot more free thinking happening in your environment around you. So there's a lot more I can say about this. We've put together a leadership handout for you, and as well as along with those blog posts. So I'm going to end now, and I'd just like to end with a question. And it's we've not talked about incisive questions because they're a very powerful tool, but they're a very complex mechanism to explain to you. But I'd just like to ask you an incisive question. An incisive question always starts with if you knew, because it's asking you to think hypothetically. If you knew that you could create better thinking and thinking environments, where would you start in your organization? Where would you start? If you knew that this could make a difference, where would you start? Thank you for your fantastic engagement.